Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That's Logan Paulsen. I'm Greg Hoffman. I appreciate you listening. Would love you to listen as often as you like. To make that easy, all you got to do is subscribe, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is that you're listening right now. If you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like, if you like it, or just fake it. Do it for us. And then subscribe, whether it's on 1067 The Fans page, on my page, at Craig Hoffman, or on Odyssey Sports. You can find whether it's clips or the entire episode of the entire podcast in all of those places. So, Logan, offensively for New York, you want to talk about variance? Man, when their offense gets cooking, it looks incredible. Daniel Jones, you're like, wow, is he good? Saquon gets out there, he's shaking people. Darius Slayton makes some of the best catches you'll see in the NFL. Richie James is quick. Like they get cooking, and you're like, wow, this offense is potent. And then you look up, and they haven't scored in 5 drives, and you just doesn't like watching them feels very different than the results ultimately are. Why does that happen? What is it that they cannot do to ultimately produce points on any kind of consistent basis?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because they do. Yeah, they are very streaky. So let's just start with like my core thought about this offense is that they're kind of similar to Washington. Is that their offensive line is not a great pass blocking group, and they are doing everything in their power to insulate them from having to pass protect. And so what you'll see is they rely heavily on the run game, and they are what's the offensive coordinator's name? His name is Mike Kafka. Kafka does a really good job of kind of being game plan specific in terms of their approach. Like against Jacksonville, where they play like this heavy run front, they bring in extra nose guards and all this stuff. They were in 11 personnel like 85% of the time. And then against Seattle, they were in a lot of like 13 and 12, and the type of plays you run out of that personnel changes pretty dramatically. So obviously he is doing his homework about what stuff works versus which team, right? So to that point, I think it's interesting because I think they do run outside zone. They don't run it super great. They don't run it like Atlanta does it, but you might see some more outside zone this week. You might see some toss crack stuff because that is stuff that's hurt this team in the past, and he seems to go through the archive and say these runs have hurt them. And that's the other thing about this team is they have a lot of variation in terms of their run game. They run gap scheme, which is like double teams and pullers. They run duo, which we've talked about. They run tight zone. They run wide zone. They run pin pull stuff, which again, a lot of teams kind of have one thing that they're pretty good at, Atlanta outside zone, and then they dabble with pin pull, right? But then they run RPOs. They run zone reads. So there's a lot of play volume in. And I mentioned how at the line of scrimmage, Daniel Jones is like calling and checking. One of the things about having high play volume is it gives you lots of answers, but you are also less effective at running those plays. So when you watch those plays, it can be very messy looking, right? Guys not fitting double teams correctly, guys not targeting the right person, free runners in the hole, because you're not speaking to what that guy or what that position does well.
Right. Frankly, that's what Washington was doing earlier in the year. Like they were running way too much stuff. And we talked about this extensively on Wednesday's podcast. And we talked about it in our chat with John Bates yesterday, how narrowing down the run game for Washington actually helped them be better at the thing that they were doing because they were doing it more often. They owned their stuff. They own their offense as opposed to feeling like they're just throwing a bunch of darts at the wall.
Right. And so to compound that, then they have to insulate the offensive line in pass protecting situations. So they run a lot of play pass. They run a lot of keeper. They run all of this stuff, all to avoid them getting into third and non-manageable situations, 3rd, 7, 3rd, and 8, because they really can't pass pro. So when they're in those situations, expect screen, expect draw, right? Because they know that they're not good in that area, right? So to me, the variance you see is that they don't own certain aspects of their offense, right? So like one mental mistake is going to be huge. The next element is physically at the skill position players. Obviously, we mentioned Slayton, but like their 2nd round pick, what's his name? Waggle? No, that's not his name.
Wan'Dale Robinson you're talking about?
There you go, Wan'Dale Robinson. Wow, yeah. I was not even close. Yeah, Wan'Dale Robinson, who's a good football player, has been out. Slay, who was their number 1 receiver when the season started, is out with an ACL. Everyone remembers him tearing it on the turf.
Shepard, you mean?
Shepard, thank you.
Yeah.
Jeez. And then Collins, who was like their number 3 guy, tore his Achilles in training camp, right? All of these guys are out. Their tight ends are kind of the land of mismatched toys outside of the starter, Daniel Bellinger, right? They've got converted quarterbacks. They've got all these different types. So when the scheme wins, when the scheme wins the play, it looks crisp. Boom, balls out, excellent. Daniel Jones, nice big arm. He's got a scrappiness and a competitiveness to his game, which is fun to watch, right? There's people all around. The offensive line loses quick. He's taking huge shots. He's running. He's getting smoked by linebackers. He is fighting for his life almost every single play, it feels like. And he is, you mentioned this earlier this season, like he steals first downs for him all the time. So that's a big reason the offense is successful. But when the scheme doesn't win, they don't have the horses outside of Slayton to win consistently, right? So there's times where the play passes up and everything is matched and he's just standing there. I mean, even the freaking check down is matched and it's just like, all right, I guess I got to run around back here and like try to dive forward and get smoked by this linebacker, right? And so that to me are the variables. There's a lot of volume in the offense. There's a lot of penalties that they take kind of surprisingly on first and second down in terms of false starts. They have a couple holds, right? Which again puts them back. But it's like the grittiness of the group, right? It's like Daniel Jones just like, it feels like he's just willing them forward and it's never super pretty. It's never super clean. They kind of just slug and claw and scratch until they find a big play, right? If you look at the Green Bay game, Saquon Barkley busts off like a 75-yard run. The Dallas game, Daniel Jones throws a dime to Slayton, right? Jacksonville, dime to Slayton on a go, right? It's not like a nuanced route where it's just like go ball, right? Or it's the pass and Pax comes across, dude's open right in the middle of the field. Huge play, right? So against Houston, that happens. So that's kind of what happens is they kind of just slug it out. They're just like the drunk dude at the bar who's just throwing haymakers until something lands. Then you're like, okay, they're in a good spot now and we're in trouble.
Yeah, that's the thing, though. They will land some.
They will.
And part of that is a volume thing. Like, they will just, like, the drunk guy at the bar is so perfect because that guy doesn't know he's getting hit. That guy doesn't know it's not working. He's just out there waylaying. You know, they're not high-quality shots. No technician is looking at him and be like, man, that guy knows how to box. No. He's just out there trying to make contact. And the Giants will, despite no matter how many times it doesn't work, despite how many times they might get sacked, whatever, they will continue to push the ball down the field vertically. Yeah. And that is something that stands out like a sore thumb, stands out tremendously when you watch them. You're like, wow, they really push the ball down the field. Yeah. It's also hilarious watching the plays in between because, they have, their running game, whatever. Some read options are like, okay, that's pretty nice. And then you have Daniel Jones will just miss wildly on some very simple throws. If he could make layups, like he'd be a really good quarterback. He just is not very good at making layups. But, man, he's got a cannon. And he will lace balls into tight windows. He will try stuff on back shoulders, especially with Slayton. Like, they will try to get the ball into Richie James' hands quickly and kind of let him turn into a punt returner on the go. Like they will do a lot of stuff to try to generate big plays. And I think this is actually a really gigantic credit to Brian Daboll. I know, saying like, oh yeah, they've got kind of a haphazard throw everything at the wall offense is not exactly the best compliment for a coach because you'd like be like, oh no, they have a distinct identity and they do this. He knows they're talent deficient. This is year one for him. He's trying to kind of throw a wild amount of variance into the game. When you're the better side, variance is bad. When you're good, you want to just be able to play the game straight up and let the fact that you're good lead you to victory over the team that you're better than. And the Giants, from a talent standpoint, are not that good. And so what Daboll has done is found a way to maximize what he's got by adding a ton of variance to the game. And frankly, it's worked. Like they're 7-5. Hilariously, both Washington and New York are negative point differential on the year, despite being playoff teams. At this point, it's pretty close. Washington's got it down to -3. They obviously had a couple of big losses early in the year, which absolutely killed that statistic for them. But the Giants are -7 on the year. And so, sometimes they're going to get their butts kicked, and it's going to be pretty substantial. And other times, it'll work and they'll put up 30 points with a bunch of guys that doesn't seem possible to score 30 points in the NFL with. And that's the exact opposite, by the way, of what Washington's doing, where Washington is like, we know our defense is great, so we're just going to ride that. And if we can shorten the game and then have a little bit of variance, towards the end, we feel like we can stop you, or if Heineke's got to cook in the final 2 minutes, he can get the job done. It's two very different approaches, but it's because the talent... But
rosters,
but they're not that different. It's just I think the biggest difference obviously is Washington's defense is excellent. New York's defense is not. And because
Yeah.
of that, they'd rather get in the shootout where Washington would like to have a little bit of variance in a low-scoring game.
Right. Yeah, I think that's that's awesome analysis. You know, I love how you describe Daniel Jones. Like there's times you're like, man, this guy is like
He's awesome.
I would love him to be down here in Washington, right?
Yeah, and then the next drive happens.
And then he'll miss something. You're like, why did you do that? Like that's a easy. Like that other thing you did was way harder, right?
Right.
And so the other thing I will say is that like they know again offensively they're deficient, and so they do have like a wrinkle each week that is kind of like this is our thing, you know. Versus Jacksonville, they run a ton of RPO. Versus the Cowboys, for example, they run a ton of keeper stuff, right? So I think that's again speaking to the variance. They try to just keep you a little off kilter until they can get one of these big plays that puts them in position for a score, right? They run Wildcat. I mean, they do all sorts of craziness, right? They're trying to get touches for Saquon Barkley in space. They're trying to do so. Like it's just there's a lot of offensive volume in, and I think again, like there's two ways to go with it, right? One is like let's see if we can find a hole, like by throwing a lot of stuff at them, and then the other way is Washington, where it's like, hey, we kind of know what we are. We know our defense is good. Let's lean into that as much as we can and speak to elevating skill sets. So yeah, I think that is kind of where they're at. And again, the one thing, the kind of X factor for me, you know, everyone talks about Saquon, everyone talks about Slayton. I think Saquon, it'll be interesting to see how he plays because as of today, I don't know if we know whether their offensive line is going to be healthy. They've been really banged up. I think Evan Neal might be back. I think their center might be back. So, and their right guard might be back. So obviously that would be huge for them. I don't know. We won't know that until later in the week probably, but
right.
If they're back, Saquon plays better with those guys in, but he hasn't been playing well recently because the offensive line's been so banged up. So the variable that I think is so interesting in this is Daniel Jones, because you said this early in the season, and when you watch him, it becomes so apparent why he's so important. It's 3rd and 11. Nobody's open. He gets hit. He spins off a tackle. He falls forward for an 11-yard gain. It's not like a pretty like, oh, let me just run out of bounds. It's like I'm getting hit. I get hit by the linebacker. I turn around. I spin down, and it's a first down. And he keeps them in games off of little stuff like that. There was a play against Baltimore, for example, where he's running. There's nobody. Everybody's covered. He shakes the defensive end. He falls forward for a 4-yard gain. It's 2nd and 6 instead of a loss of whatever, right? And it's not like Lamar Jackson back there, but he is the guy that has been able, through just kind of sheer force of will, to just keep them on schedule in certain situations. So he makes mistakes, like you said, but he also is the guy that's like gutting out, getting shot in the chest by a middle linebacker who the offensive line didn't block to complete a slant route for a first down. You know what I mean? Like his toughness and his grit are the thing. It's propelling this team forward. And he deserves a lot of credit for where they're at. He deserves a lot of, he's like, it's weird. He's like a fireman who starts fires and then puts them out himself. Like it's this really weird
The
thing.
arsonist fireman.
Yeah, the arsonist fireman. But I have a lot of respect for that physical kind of will to win that he seems to be showing almost every single play for them.
Yeah, he is a guy who's also had some monster games against Washington in his career. And he's actually performed pretty well against the NFC East in general. Like you look at, the numbers against Philly, the numbers against Dallas, the numbers against Washington, they're actually not that different in terms of like yardage and things. He's got 9 touchdowns to 3 picks in his 9 career games against, his 5 career games against Washington. So we're talking 9 touchdowns in 5 games. There's something about this team that he has played really well. And as you mentioned off the top of the show, like Meadowlands have kind of been a house of horrors for this team. So weird stuff tends to happen. But you look at the statistics, even just this year, they're middle of the pack in 3rd down conversions offensively, which doesn't make any sense based on anything else we've said. Like they get in bad down and distances all the time. They're, throwing balls downfield, low percentage completions. And so all of a sudden it's 2nd and 10, they've run it, it's 3rd and 9. And then lo and behold, Jones is the guy who bails them out, sometimes with his arm, but often with his legs. And I think that is obviously something to monitor in this one is what kind of damage does he do with his legs? And then just, does he have another day? Like, does he have these days that he seemed to always have against Washington where he plays way out over his skis and is able to control it? The last thing I want to ask you, though, real quick, We touched about this on this a little bit on Wednesday. And I know Ron was asked about it, and he said ultimately it was a good thing what happened against Mariota on Sunday. But the zone read element and quarterback run is something that they will major in. And you wonder if that's like after watching the Atlanta tape, their game plan quirk, if you will. You said they always kind of pick something. How do you think Washington can handle this version of the zone read compared to what they did against Atlanta, where Mariota had a really, really good day on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think, when you look at, so I've heard say, oh, like Daniel Jones runs the zone read better than Marcus Mariota or whatever. I couldn't disagree with that more. Like Mariota is very good at it. He's very good at the fake. He's very good at pulling it. He's very good at reading it. And people think, oh, it's just zone read. You got to read it, right? But I've been with teams where we've tried to install that, and the quarterback they don't have a feel for it, right? It just doesn't work for them. So Mariota is that way. Daniel Jones is good at it, but I think Mariota is better. And I think what I would say is if I was Jack and if I was Washington, I would really look at the Dallas game because, again, that's a very good defensive front. I'd look how they attack that group. I would look at also their solution versus, gosh, I forget the team. But they had another kind of interesting game plan solution. It was really centered around the keeper game, right? So I love that you bring up the zone read thing because I think they'll do that more than they have shown recently. It's not like it's so. Let me just put that in context. The Giants run it probably 4 times a game, right? Maybe 5 times, and it's usually in the red zone or third and short situations. And they're like, we need to kind of get a play here, right? So that's kind of when they use it. I think it'll be more in the field. To your point, also the keeper stuff has been big for them, even when they're not playing good defensive fronts. So to me, the solution there is just play it the way you played. James played it the last play of the game. Run right at the quarterback. Run right at him every single play. Because if you can kill their keeper game, that's like 10% of their offense. And if they're running it, if they're running the zone read or they're planning on running it 10 more plays, you're killing essentially almost half of their offense, 33% of their offense, just killing those 20 plays. So that would be my thing, is like have a plan for him leaving the pocket and when he's trying to read the defensive end and just negate it. If that's their solution, don't screw it, basically. If they want to go RPO, obviously that becomes a little bit more problematic. But I do think you have played RPO relatively well because you ran it a lot in training camp and your defense is pretty familiar with it. So I think if you can kind of manage whatever that wrinkle is, whether it's the zone read, whether it's the keeper RPO, let's say they run a little bit more outside zone. I said this at the top, because like outside zone, everyone says, oh, look at Atlanta. That would be a great game plan wrinkle for New York. No one's going to run it like Atlanta runs it. Like, right. I hate to break it to people like who think this was like the doom and gloom. Like, New York is good at running the football. They're not Atlanta.
Yeah,
so
nobody's Atlanta except for San Francisco. So we can have that discussion on Christmas
Eve. Right. And I think John and Payne are going to wreck that shop. You know what I mean? I think even John Ridgeway, who had a tough time against Atlanta, is going to beat this center up. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think it's more in line with what you're thinking. Quarterback run, quarterback keeper, what's the play action pass pack, that kind of stuff is what you need to account for. Because like you said, they can find big plays off of these kind of weird wrinkly things. And it's not like trick plays. It's just they have a deep offensive bag. So what's going to be on docket for this week?
Yeah, the Washington's speed is very helpful here. The fact that they play a lot of smaller bodies that can play bigger. They play Cam Curl in the box a ton. Jamin is obviously incredibly fast. If they can use some of that team speed to maybe even overcome a mental mistake, just run around it. That obviously is very helpful, having all those guys on the field. The other thing, though, obviously it's not as big of a deal as if you're playing a team with a ton of threats at wide receiver. But St. Juice, as far as we know, could be out for a couple of weeks here. Hopefully he's back for the next Giants game. This bye coming at a good time for him. But some of the tight man coverage that you might play against an RPO game where, hey, we're pulling it. We got to make sure we're on top of the slant. We're on top of this. And a lot of players are going to be flowing towards the run. It puts a lot on the DBs. Not having St. Just is obviously not ideal. So we'll see what Christian Holmes can do. We'll see what Danny Johnson can do. Rashad Wildgoose and obviously Kendall Fuller being in that number 1 spot while St. Just is out.
Craig, you ate your Wheaties today or something, man, because that is like your 4th excellent football point in a row.
Let's go.
So I will see. Yeah, that becomes interesting in terms of more globally, right? Because you do want to play a little bit more man versus RPO because it helps in terms of making sure you have enough bodies to stop the run. And then you say, how does Kendall Fuller match up with Slayton? And he does not match up with Slayton well. It's like his kryptonite, right? He doesn't like to play super fast wide receivers, and Slayton is kind of that super fast wide receiver body type. And, Benjamin St-Juste has shown an ability to handle that. But of those guys you mentioned, who is the guy you say, oh, we want to match up in this? And maybe you feel like you don't need to against this team. Maybe you feel like you can just bend but don't break and bleed them out, and they're going to make a mistake and you're going to be able to capitalize on it. But that is an interesting dynamic for sure. And you say, well, Forrest has done a good job. Maybe you can insulate some of that. Who knows? But that's something, if you're a fan, just keep an eye on that. Like, what's their solution for a guy who's maybe not a top receiver, but he has a trait that can be very damaging in terms of, the Giants scoring points.
Yeah, and especially if they want to hit some of those big plays and, Kendall can't run with them down the field, that becomes reminiscent of what happened earlier in the year, frankly, where Kendall got a lot of balls caught on his head, even though he's been great as of late.
Subscribe. As long as you do subscribe to one of these platforms, that would be very helpful for us.
Yeah, do it, or Logan's going to come to your house and he's going to be a sift blocker and knock you over.
Cut the legs out from under you, right?
You can't even do that on the field, but we can do it in real life.